The bitter New York wind clawed at Natalie's thin jacket, but the chill inside her small apartment was worse. Overdue notices fanned across her chipped kitchen table, a stark, ugly mosaic of medical bills that mocked her dwindling bank account. Her mother's name, printed neatly on each one, felt like a lead weight pressing on Natalie's chest. She traced a finger over the numbers, the zeros blurring into a grim reminder of how far she'd fallen from the conservatory stage. Once, she'd dreamed of concert halls, of her voice soaring. Now, it was just her humming a low, wordless melody, a comfort her mother had taught her, a private defiance against the world trying to crush her spirit. She was 27, a singer with no stage and a daughter drowning in debt. Independence, she'd once called it. Now it felt like a cage. The nanny agency glittered, all polished chrome and hushed luxury, a universe away from Natalie's peeling paint. She smoothed her worn skirt, feeling a familiar prickle of inadequacy, but she pushed it down. Valentina needed her. This job, this lifeline, wasn't about dreams, it was about survival. The agency owner, a woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, spoke in clipped, efficient tones. She handed Natalie a sleek key fob, a small black rectangle that felt surprisingly heavy in her palm. "For access to the penthouse building," the woman explained, her voice devoid of warmth. Natalie nodded, clutching it tight. A tiny beacon of hope in the vast uncertainty. Miles away, high above the snow-dusted expanse of Central Park, Marco Valentini stood at his penthouse window. The city stretched out beneath him, a glittering testament to his power, yet the vast space felt cold, empty. 38, impeccably dressed. He was a man forged in quiet steel, his grief for his late wife a silent, ever-present companion. His daughter, Valentina, barely 5, was a ghost in the opulent rooms, her bright spirit muted by loss. Marco watched the snow fall, an ache in his chest. He needed a solution, a balm for his child's wounded heart, but he didn't know how to find it. He just knew he couldn't fail her. Natalie stepped out of the private elevator, her heart thrumming against her ribs. The penthouse was breathtaking, cold and beautiful like a diamond. Then she saw him, Marco Valentini. He stood by the nursery door, a stark silhouette against the city lights, his eyes like chips of dark ice as they raked over her. Intimidation was a language he spoke fluently. Natalie felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his gaze, refusing to flinch. She was here for Valentina, not to be cowed. He asked a few sharp questions, his voice deep, assessing. She answered with direct honesty, her vulnerability showing, but so did her unwavering resolve. He saw it all, her quiet strength, her desperation, her surprising composure. "You're hired," he said, the words cutting through the tense silence. Natalie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She knew nothing of the discreetly bugged baby monitor already active in Valentina's nursery, a tiny hidden SIM card broadcasting every sound. She knew nothing of Marco's true world, or the test he'd already begun, unknowingly compromised before she'd even stepped foot inside. She only knew she had a job and a child to care for. The penthouse was sterile, a mausoleum of quiet wealth. Natalie moved through it like a ghost her first few days, each polished surface and hushed corridor, emphasizing the chasm between her old life and this gilded cage. She saw the vastness, the perfection, and felt nothing but cold. But then there was Valentina. The little girl, barely 5, carried a silent sorrow Natalie recognized instantly. It was in the way she clutched a faded teddy bear, the way her eyes, large and shadowed, watched Natalie with a cautious curiosity. Natalie felt an immediate aching pull, a need to reach past the polished veneer and touch the raw grief she sensed. She found the nursery on the 3rd day. It was beautiful, filled with expensive toys, but it felt as empty as the rest of the penthouse. On the nightstand, next to a pristine lamp, sat a music box. A tiny ballerina, frozen in mid-pirouette, her porcelain skirt chipped, a hairline crack running down her delicate arm. Natalie's heart ached. It was a perfect metaphor for Valentina, a broken, precious thing in a perfect, cold world. She picked it up, tracing the crack. With her thumb, a silent promise forming in her mind. That evening the silence shattered. Valentina's cries echoed through the vast apartment, raw and inconsolable. "Mama! Mama!" she wailed, her small body shaking, curled in a ball on her bed. Natalie rushed to the nursery, her own chest tightening. She tried everything she knew, gentle hugs, soft words, offering a storybook. Nothing worked. The grief was too deep, too fresh, too overwhelming for the child. Unbeknownst to Natalie, Marco had heard the cries. The sound pierced through the carefully constructed walls of his study, through the layers of his own controlled grief. He found himself drawn to the nursery, hovering in the doorway. He saw Natalie, her brow furrowed with concern. Her movements gentle, persistent. She was trying so hard. He slipped into a nearby armchair, sinking back, eyes closed. He pretended to sleep, but every fiber of his being was alert, observing. He watched Natalie, watched his daughter, a silent sentinel in the dim light. The baby monitor, perched innocently on a shelf, glowed with a faint, steady light, broadcasting every sound to unknown ears. Natalie felt a familiar desperation rising. Valentina's sobs weren't abating. All the usual tricks were failing. Then instinct took over. She remembered her own mother, remembered the quiet strength in her voice, the melody that had always brought peace. Natalie took a deep breath, and softly, hesitantly, she began to sing. It was her mother's lullaby, a unique, haunting melody born from their own shared struggles, a song of resilience and quiet hope. Her voice, once trained for grand stages, was now a fragile whisper in the quiet nursery. Valentina's sobs faltered. Her small body stilled. She lifted her head, her tear-streaked face turned towards Natalie, mesmerized. As Natalie continued, the melody weaving through the air, Valentina's eyelids grew heavy. Slowly, her small hand uncurled from the teddy bear, reaching out for Natalie's. Her breathing deepened, the last shuddering sob escaping as she finally drifted to sleep, the lullaby a soft blanket around her. Marco's eyes, which had been barely slits, opened fully. He watched Natalie, a tremor passing through him. He'd never seen Valentina so peaceful, not since his wife had died, never seen anyone connect with her like this. The lullaby, simple yet profound, had touched something deep inside him too. It was a melody he'd never heard, yet it resonated with a forgotten tenderness. Natalie's warmth, her genuine care, was a stark contrast to the transactional world he inhabited. A spark ignited within him, a glimmer of hope he hadn't known he still possessed. This woman, this maid, was something extraordinary. Natalie finished the lullaby, her voice fading into the quiet of the room. Valentina was deeply asleep, her face finally serene. Natalie carefully tucked the plush red wool blanket she'd found in the closet around the little girl, a small gesture of comfort. As she straightened, she saw Marco. He wasn't pretending to sleep anymore. He rose from the armchair, his movements fluid, silent, but there was a new intensity in his gaze, a quiet fire she hadn't seen before. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a raw emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "Ensure that Natalie has everything she needs," he stated, his voice low, directed at the unseen staff through the intercom, but his eyes never left Natalie. "And Valentina's comfort and safety are paramount always," It was a terse directive, but the weight of it was immense. It was an unspoken acknowledgement, a silent declaration that Natalie was no longer just a maid. She was something more, something vital. The words hung in the air, a silent promise, a subtle threat to anyone who might stand in their way. Natalie felt a shiver, a mix of fear and a strange, burgeoning warmth. He saw her. He truly saw her. And the world he inhabited, she realized, was far more complex than she could have ever imagined. The lullaby had changed everything. Natalie felt it in the subtle shift of the air, in the way Marco's presence seemed to linger around her, even when he wasn't visibly there. Now, as she tidied Valentina's nursery, folding tiny clothes with meticulous care, she felt the weight of his gaze from across the room, or sometimes from just outside the door. He didn't always speak, didn't always acknowledge her, but she knew he was there. His eyes, dark and intense, would track her. Movements as she read Valentina a story or helped the little girl with her drawing. It was a mix of appreciation, she thought, for how quickly Valentina had warmed to her, but also something deeper, a possessiveness that made a prickle of unease run down Natalie's spine. He was watching, always watching, and she couldn't quite decipher what he was looking for. One afternoon, Valentina was building a tower of blocks, her small face scrunched in concentration, while Natalie hummed a quiet tune. Dusting the shelves, Marco entered the room, ostensibly to check on his daughter, but his eyes locked onto Natalie first. She felt her cheeks warm under his scrutiny. He didn't say anything about the cleaning, didn't comment on Valentina's tower. He just observed, a silent, powerful force in the room. His gaze made her acutely aware of her hands, her voice, every small gesture. She felt like an exhibit, a specimen under a microscope, and a flicker of her old stubborn independence flared. She wasn't just a maid, and she wouldn't be reduced to a curiosity. Later that day, a summons came to Marco's study. The room was all dark wood and leather, a place of quiet power that felt suffocating. He sat behind a massive desk, his posture impeccable, his expression unreadable. "Natalie," he began, his voice low, measured, "tell me about your background, your family, your previous employment." It wasn't a request, it was an interrogation. Natalie felt her hackles rise. "My resume covered most." "Of that, Mr. Valentini," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her stomach. "I believe my focus here is Valentina, and my performance speaks for itself." His eyes narrowed, a glint of something cold entering them. "In this house, Natalie, everything is connected to Valentina's safety. Your past is not an abstract concept when her well-being is at stake." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity palpable. "Medical bills, I believe the agency mentioned. A mother to care for." He was probing, looking for weaknesses, for leverage. A wave of anger, hot and unexpected, washed over her. He had no right to dig into her private pain. "My mother's health is my concern, not a qualification for this job," she shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. "I took this position because I needed it, yes, but I stay because I care about Valentina. You hired me for my abilities, not to own my life story." Marco studied her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly masked. He had expected compliance, not defiance. He saw her vulnerability, yes, but also a core of steel. He saw her genuine care for Valentina, that much was clear. But he also saw a woman who would not be easily controlled. The power dynamics in the room hummed, a tangible current between them. He nodded slowly, a single decisive movement. "Understood," he said, the word a dismissal, but his gaze lingered, a silent acknowledgement of her defiance, and perhaps a reluctant respect. The incident occurred 2 Days later, a stark reminder that the world outside their penthouse was not as pristine as the marble floors within. Natalie was in the nursery, playing a quiet game with Valentina, when she glanced out the snow-flecked window. Below, on the street, a dark sedan idled, its engine running. Not unusual, except a man in a rumpled suit stood beside it, openly aiming a long-lens camera not at the building's grand entrance, but directly up at their windows. He snapped a few shots, then spoke into a phone, his gaze sweeping the penthouse's upper floors. A cold dread settled in Natalie's stomach. It wasn't a tourist. It was too deliberate, too focused. She quickly pulled Valentina away from the window, her heart pounding. Moments later, she heard it, the low, urgent murmur of Marco's voice from his study, followed by the rapid, clipped commands of his security detail. The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted, becoming taut, electrified. Guards moved with greater purpose. The doors seemed to lock with a more definitive click. Marco appeared in the hallway, his face a mask of grim determination. He didn't address Natalie directly, but his eyes, sharp and alert, swept over her, then Valentina. He was on the phone, his voice a low growl. "Someone's getting sloppy," she heard him say, "or someone's talking." The words hung in the air, chilling. Natalie understood then. The danger he'd hinted at, the reason for his intense scrutiny, was real, and it was closing in. She was no longer just a maid. She was inside his world, a world far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. And Valentina, her sweet, grieving Valentina, was at the heart of it. The low growl of Marco's voice, the quick, clipped commands, still echoed in Natalie's mind. The man with the camera, the sudden tightening of security, it all clicked into place, a terrifying puzzle. Her world, once just about paying bills and finding her voice, had collided with his, and his world was dangerous. She tried to insulate herself, to keep her distance, but the invisible threads had already pulled her in. She was no longer an outsider. She was part of the target. A knock on her door, sharp and immediate, sent a jolt through her. It was Marco. His face was harder than she'd ever seen it, his jaw tight, eyes like flint. He didn't invite her to his study this time. He just stood there, a formidable presence filling the doorway. "Natalie," he began, his voice devoid of its usual controlled calm, a low rumble of suppressed fury. "The incident today was not random. Valentina is a target." Natalie's breath hitched. Valentina, her small, grieving charge. "Who?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper. Marco's gaze intensified, locking onto hers. "People who operate outside the law, people who deal in leverage. My world, as you've no doubt surmised, is not a simple one. There are conflicts, and children, unfortunately, are seen as a means to an end." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The implication was clear, chilling. Valentina was a pawn in a game Natalie couldn't begin to comprehend. "I need to ensure her absolute safety," Marco continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but the steel beneath it was undeniable. "And yours, by extension." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him, making the space suddenly feel smaller, more suffocating. "This is no longer just a job, Natalie. It's a matter of survival." Natalie's heart hammered against her ribs. She understood the words, but the gravity of them settled over her like a shroud. Survival, for Valentina, for her. Marco's next words came with the force of an ultimatum. "I am offering you enhanced protection. This penthouse will become a fortress. You and Valentina will remain inside. All outside contact will be restricted, no visitors. Your phone will be secured." He framed it as safety, as necessary measures, but Natalie heard the unspoken truth beneath his words. Lockdown, confinement, a gilded cage. Her Fiercely independent spirit recoiled. She would be a prisoner in luxury, stripped of her autonomy, her choices. He was offering her protection, yes, but at the cost of her freedom. The thought was repugnant, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. "I understand the need for security, Mr. Valentini," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "but I can't be locked away. I have a life. My mother—" He cut her off, his voice firm, unyielding. "Your mother's bills will be taken care of. Any debts settled. Consider it part of the arrangement, but in return you must accept these terms. For Valentina." He used the child's name like a weapon, knowing it would pierce her defenses. He knew her weakness, her unwavering devotion to the little girl. Natalie felt torn, a raw wound opening in her chest. Her mind screamed in protest. Her independence, her hard-won self-reliance was everything. To be bought, to be owned, even indirectly, went against every fiber of her being. But then she pictured Valentina's tear-streaked face, remembered the innocent trust in her eyes as she slept. How could she refuse? How could she prioritize her own pride over the child's safety? The thought of Valentina being harmed, of her being used as leverage, made her stomach churn. The choice was agonizing, a brutal sacrifice of self for the sake of another. She was trapped, caught between her deepest values and the terrifying reality of his world. She looked at Marco, at the unyielding resolve in his dark eyes. He wouldn't compromise. He couldn't. He was offering her a choice, but it was no choice at all. Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. "I'll stay," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "For Valentina." A flicker of something, relief, satisfaction, crossed Marco's face, quickly gone. He gave a single, curt nod. "Good." He turned, walking towards a mahogany chest near the wall. He pulled out a folded item, a rich, deep red. It was a plush wool blanket, thick and luxurious. "For Valentina," he said, extending it to Natalie, "for her comfort." Natalie took the blanket, the soft wool warm in her hands. It was beautiful, a vibrant splash of color in the stark room. It was meant to symbolize comfort, protection. But as she held it, feeling its weight, she knew it represented something else for her. It was a physical manifestation of her new confinement, a soft, beautiful cage. She was in, truly in, his dangerous world. And there was no turning back. The red wool blanket lay heavy in Natalie's arms, a beautiful, suffocating weight. She'd said yes for Valentina, but a fierce, protective instinct for her own self refused to be silenced. She wouldn't be a docile possession, no matter how golden the cage. She found Marco in his study again, a fortress of dark wood and unspoken power. He looked up, his expression unreadable, waiting. "Mr. Valentini," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I agreed to your terms for Valentina's safety, but my terms are equally important." She watched his dark eyes narrow, but she pushed on. "I will not be a prisoner in this penthouse. I require specific hours for my personal time, even if those hours are spent within these walls. I need my own space, undisturbed. And I am Valentina's caregiver, not your property. My decisions regarding her daily routine, her comfort, her needs are mine to make. With your input, yes, but not under your absolute command." A muscle twitched in Marco's jaw. He was used to absolute command, to unquestioning obedience. Natalie saw the surprise, then a flicker of something almost like anger in his eyes. He leaned back, his gaze raking over her, assessing. He'd expected gratitude, maybe a quiet resignation. He hadn't expected this defiant fire, but as he looked at her, at the stubborn set of her chin, the unwavering directness in her gaze, something shifted. Her strength, her refusal to be cowed, was a stark contrast to the pliable women of his world. It was infuriating, yes, but also undeniably captivating. He saw not just a maid, but a woman of formidable integrity, and the unexpected defiance only deepened the burgeoning attraction, a dangerous spark in his carefully controlled world. "Understood," he said, the word a low rumble in the quiet room, an admission she hadn't expected. He didn't elaborate, didn't argue. He simply accepted it, a quiet respect dawning in his eyes. He saw the value in her fire, the raw, untamed spirit that refused to be extinguished. It was a quality he secretly admired, a stark contrast to the stifling conformity that often surrounded him. He found himself drawn to it, to her, in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The tension between them, once purely adversarial, now hummed with a different, more complicated current. The new dynamic was tested that very evening. Valentina, unsettled by the day's events and the subtle shifts in the household, was particularly difficult at bedtime. She clung to Natalie, refusing to let go, her small body trembling with a fresh wave of anxiety. Marco, observing from the doorway, stepped in. "Valentina," he said, his voice softer than Natalie had ever heard it, but the child only buried her face deeper into Natalie's shoulder. Natalie looked at him, a silent plea in her eyes. He nodded, understanding. He sat on the edge of the bed, a formidable man suddenly rendered gentle. They worked in tandem, a silent, unspoken choreography. Natalie sang the lullaby, her voice a soft balm, while Marco stroked Valentina's hair, his large hand surprisingly tender. At one point, as Natalie adjusted the red wool blanket around Valentina, their hands brushed. It was a fleeting contact, barely a feather-light touch, but an electric current shot through Natalie's arm, up to her chest, her breath hitched. Marco's eyes met hers across Valentina's sleeping form, and the unspoken attraction, the raw, undeniable pull flared between them, hot and intense, a silent confession in the dimly lit nursery. Later, alone in her new, expanded but still confined quarters, Natalie walked to the snow-flecked window. The city lights twinkled like scattered diamonds, vast and indifferent. She was safer, undeniably. Valentina was safer. Her mother's medical debts would be handled, a crushing weight lifted from her shoulders. Yet, as she looked out at the sprawling metropolis, she felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. The gilded cage was beautiful, luxurious even. But it was still a cage. She was bound by invisible chains, by Marco's unspoken rules, by the very act of protection. A cold knot formed in her stomach. She had traded her independence for security, her freedom for a child's safety. Was it worth the cost? Only time, she knew, would tell. The fragile truce Natalie had established with Marco, the unspoken acknowledgement of her autonomy, felt like it shattered with the glass. She was in Valentina's playroom, building a precarious block tower, when a distant, sharp crash echoed from somewhere below, followed by the urgent shouts of security. Her blood ran cold. Valentina flinched, her small hands freezing mid-reach. Natalie scooped her up, holding her close, her heart thudding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Marco was already in the main living area, his back to her, barking commands into a phone. His voice, usually so controlled, was laced with a chilling fury. One of his security men, grim-faced, approached him, holding a shard of thick, specialized glass. "Delivery bay, sir," the man reported, his voice low. "Nothing taken but a clear message. This was no random act." Natalie heard the words, saw the glint of the broken glass. It was targeted. It was a warning. The cold dread from the street incident days ago intensified, solidifying into a terrifying certainty. The invisible war was no longer just a whisper. It was a violent declaration. Marco's response was immediate and absolute. The penthouse, already a fortress, transformed into an impenetrable vault. New guards, stern-faced and silent, appeared, their presence a constant, watchful shadow. Motion sensors were installed in new places, cameras added to blind spots. Natalie felt the walls closing in, not just figuratively but physically. Her movements were tracked, her phone usage monitored, every call, every text scrutinized. A knot of resentment twisted in her stomach. Her independence, her hard-won freedom, was being systematically dismantled. She was a bird in a gilded cage, and the bars were tightening. But when she looked at Valentina, who now clung to her even more, the resentment faded, replaced by a cold understanding. This wasn't about control, it was about survival. Late that night, Marco found her by the nursery window, looking out at the city lights. Valentina was asleep, the red wool blanket a bright splash of comfort around her. He stood silently for a moment, then spoke, his voice unusually quiet, almost weary. "Natalie," he said, and she turned, startled by the raw vulnerability in his tone. "You deserve to know what you're up against. What Valentina is up against." He walked to the window, gazing out at his empire. "My family. We're not in the business of finance alone. There are old alliances, old rivalries, debts that are never truly paid, and leverage. Always leverage." He didn't use names, didn't explicitly label his world, but the implications were clear, chilling. He was talking about the Mafia, about a ruthless game of power and intimidation. "Valentina," he continued, his voice tight, "is the ultimate prize for my enemies. To them, she's not a child. She's a weapon." He turned to face her, his dark eyes holding a depth of pain she hadn't seen before. "I made an oath. No harm to children, no coercion, debts paid clean. They violate every part of that." Natalie felt a shiver. This man, who seemed so unyielding, carried a code, a burden she was only just beginning to comprehend. His world wasn't just about money. It was about power and the terrifying consequences of challenging it. As the days blurred into a tense, hyper-vigilant routine, Natalie's sharp instincts, honed by years of navigating her own difficult life, began to notice cracks in the facade of perfection. The household staff, once a silent, efficient machine, now seemed off. The kitchen supervisor, a woman named Sophia, usually so meticulous, was increasingly distracted, her eyes darting nervously. Natalie overheard hushed conversations between two of the security guards near the service elevator, their voices dropping to whispers when she approached. A new cleaning woman, recently hired, lingered in the nursery longer than necessary, her gaze sweeping over Valentina's belongings with an unsettling curiosity. Natalie dismissed it as paranoia at first, a side effect of the suffocating security, but the feeling persisted. Something was wrong. Someone wasn't as loyal as they seemed. Her senses, once focused on melodies and overdue bills, were now acutely tuned to every subtle shift, every whisper in the wind. The quiet hum of the penthouse's ventilation system, once a soothing backdrop, now felt like the low thrum of a caged beast. Natalie watched Valentina play, her small world shrinking with each passing hour. Marco's suspicion of an internal leak, a gut feeling he'd harbored, had solidified into terrifying certainty that morning. A scheduled doctor's appointment for Valentina, known only to Marco, and his most trusted staff, had been abruptly cancelled due to an unforeseen security risk. Later, a discreet delivery meant for Marco, a highly sensitive document, had been intercepted and returned with a single, unnerving symbol drawn on its cover, a symbol Marco recognized as his rival's personal mark. It was a clear, undeniable message. "I know your moves. I am inside." His response was a cold, unyielding clampdown. The penthouse became truly inescapable, Natalie's access to the outside world, already limited, vanished entirely. Her phone, now a carefully monitored device, was only for essential calls, screened and recorded. She was no longer allowed in common areas without a guard present. Every door seemed to lock with a heavier thud. Every window became a symbol of her imprisonment. She felt the breath being squeezed from her lungs, the gilded walls pressing in. Her resentment flared, hot and sharp. This wasn't protection. It was suffocation. She found him in his study, the air thick with tension. He stood by the window, a dark silhouette against the stormy sky, his shoulders rigid. "This is unacceptable, Mr. Valentini," she stated, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "I understand the danger, but I cannot be locked down like this. I am not a prisoner. I am Valentina's caregiver. My ability to think, to react, to be present for her is crucial, not my compliance." He turned, his eyes piercing, filled with a controlled fury that made her skin prickle. "Your agency, Natalie, means nothing if you are dead, or if Valentina is gone. I need you safe. I need her safe. That means complete control, complete security." "No," she shot back, stepping closer, her heart pounding. "It means I need to be a partner in this, not a liability, not a possession you lock away. I see things, I hear things, I can help. You hired me for my mind, remember? Not just my hands." She saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, a momentary waver in his iron control. Her defiance, she realized, was a language he understood, even if he didn't appreciate it. Later, she sat in Valentina's nursery, the child curled up beside her, quietly drawing. Natalie's gaze drifted to the music box on the nightstand. The tiny ballerina, still cracked, still broken, seemed to mirror Valentina's own fractured world, a world that Natalie, with every fiber of her being, wanted to protect. The cracked porcelain spoke of innocence, damaged, of beauty marred, but also of resilience. It was a visual representation of everything she was fighting for, a silent promise to mend what was broken, to shield what was vulnerable. She would not let Valentina be hurt again. She would not let this powerful, controlling man break her spirit either. Her fingers idly traced the smooth surface of the nightstand, then brushed against something small and cool. It was the nanny agency key fob, the sleek black rectangle she'd been given on her first day. She picked it up, turning it over in her palm. It seemed so insignificant now, a relic from a simpler, safer time. But then a thought, a tiny spark, began to form. The agency owner's too bright smile, the slightly off questions, the way she'd emphasized Marco's need for discretion. Natalie remembered the initial interview, the almost unnerving ease with which she'd been hired, and the fact that the bugged monitor had been active from her very first day. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. What if the leak wasn't just within the household? What if it started even before she arrived? She fiddled with the fob, a small black rectangle that suddenly felt heavy with unspoken possibilities, a seed of an idea taking root in the tense silence. The suffocating walls of the penthouse pressed in on Natalie. Her confinement, meant for safety, felt like a slow strangulation of her spirit. She watched Valentina, so small and vulnerable, and a fierce resolve hardened inside her. She wouldn't just sit by, a helpless pawn. Her instincts, honed by years of scraping by, screamed at her to act. She remembered the nervous kitchen supervisor, Sophia, the whispered conversations of the guards, the new cleaning woman who lingered too long in the nursery. One of them, she was sure, was the leak. Her role as a maid gave her access, a cloak of invisibility. She began to observe, not just clean. She lingered near the staff pantry, listening. She noticed the cleaning woman, Elena, always had her phone with her, tucked deep into her apron pocket, and she always made sure to take her breaks alone in an obscure service stairwell. Natalie waited. The next day, during Eleanor's break, Natalie claimed she needed to check supplies in the same area. She heard the hushed, frantic voice before she saw Eleanor. Eleanor was on her phone, her back to the wall, eyes darting nervously. "I need the money now," Eleanor hissed into the phone, her voice barely audible. "They're tightening security. I can't get close to the girl anymore. It's too risky. Just tell them I've confirmed the location. They'll need a new plan." Natalie froze, her heart hammering. Location confirmed. The words were a cold spike in her chest. She had found the leak. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Marco's voice, a low, dangerous growl, sliced through the tense silence of the stairwell. Natalie whirled around, her blood turning to ice. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, a silent predator, his face a mask of furious disbelief. Elena gasped, dropping her phone, her face paling to an ashen white. Marco dismissed Elena with a single furious gesture to his approaching guards. Then his eyes, blazing with an icy rage, locked onto Natalie. "You jeopardized everything!" he thundered, his voice barely controlled. "Your life! Valentina's safety! I told you to stay put, to let my security handle this! This is not a game, Natalie!" "I found your leak!" Natalie shot back, her own anger flaring, fueled by fear and resentment. "Your security missed her! Elena was confirming Valentina's location to whoever wants to snatch her. I heard her." She stood her ground, refusing to be cowed, even as her body trembled. "You locked me down, treated me like a fragile object. But I used my brain. I used my eyes. I can help, Marco. I won't just be a victim." He stalked towards her, his presence overwhelming, radiating fury. "You could have been killed. Do you understand the risks you took?" He stopped inches from her, his breath warm against her face, his eyes burning. Into hers. "I told you I'd protect you. I told you I'd protect Valentina. This is not how it works." Natalie met his gaze, unflinching. "And I told you I wouldn't be owned. I told you I wouldn't be a prisoner. My instincts just saved Valentina from a potential snatch, Mr. Valentini. Your control, your rules, almost let it happen." The words hung heavy in the air, a challenge, a desperate assertion of her worth. Marco stared at her, his fury slowly, visibly, giving way to something else. He saw the terror in her eyes, yes, but also the unwavering conviction, the fierce intelligence that had just uncovered a critical betrayal under his own roof. He had expected compliance, had demanded it. But her defiance, her raw, unyielding courage, had yielded results his own vast security network had missed. He saw not just a stubborn woman, but a formidable ally, someone with a unique perspective, a different kind of strength. He needed her sharp mind, her intuitive understanding of the subtleties of human behavior far more than he needed her quiet obedience. His grip on control loosened, not out of weakness, but out of a dawning, reluctant respect. He realized then he needed her active involvement, her independent thought, not just her compliance. He needed her. Meanwhile, miles away in a grimy, forgotten apartment, the nanny agency owner clutched a cheap burner phone, her face ashen, sweat beading on her forehead. "They're onto us," she whispered, her voice raw with panic. "The maid." She heard Elena. "The plan's compromised. I need that money now. I told you I'd give you everything you need, but I can't hold them off much longer. My gambling debts, they're calling in everything. I need a payout, or I'm dead." She disconnected the call, her hand shaking violently, her eyes darting around the squalid room, seeing shadows where there were none. The walls were closing in, and she was trapped between a ruthless rival and a furious Marco Valentini. The fury had drained from Marco's eyes replaced by a grudging, then growing respect. He had seen her fire, her courage, and the cold, hard proof of her intuition. He had tried to cage her, to control her, but she had fought back, and in doing so had just saved his daughter from a terrifying breach. He knew then that he couldn't fight this war alone, not effectively. He needed her. He needed her eyes, her mind, her raw, untamed insight. "You're right," he said. The words a low admission, an offering of truce. His gaze, no longer accusatory, was now sharp with a new intensity, a challenge. "You want to be a partner? Then be one. But understand, Natalie, this is not a game. You are now fully inside my world. There is no turning back." He paused, then gestured to the vast, detailed map of the penthouse pinned to a corkboard in his study, covered with security annotations. "Come, there's much you need to know." Natalie felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of fear and exhilaration. She had pushed back, and he had yielded. She walked to the map, her heart thrumming. Marco began to speak, his voice losing its clipped formality, revealing the intricate, dangerous web of his life. He named his rival, a shadowy figure known for ruthless tactics. He spoke of old feuds, of territories, of power plays, and the brutal calculus that made Valentina a prize. He laid bare the motivations, the specific vulnerabilities, the history of his family, not as a boss to an employee, but as one soldier briefing another. Natalie listened, absorbing every detail, her mind racing, connecting the dots. His world was darker, more complex than she had ever imagined, but she was no longer just a spectator. She was in. Armed with this terrifying new knowledge, Natalie approached the problem with a fresh perspective, her mind buzzing. Marco's security team, for all their sophisticated technology, thought like soldiers. She thought like a caregiver, a resident, someone intimately familiar with the rhythms of the home. Elena knew Valentina's routine, she pointed out, tracing a finger on the map's nursery section. She knew when she napped, when she played. That's how they planned to snatch her. Marco nodded, listening intently. What about the other staff? What about their patterns? She proposed leveraging the everyday. The ventilation system has cameras, right? But what about the sound? What if we could use the usual household noises, the hum of the dishwasher, the vacuum, as cover or as a trigger? She thought about Valentina's favorite hiding spots, the places a child would instinctively go. She remembered the cracked music box, the red wool blanket. These weren't just objects, they were part of Valentina's world, and could be tools. Marco's security chief, initially skeptical of the maid's ideas, found himself nodding as Natalie outlined how a seemingly innocuous change in a light fixture's schedule or a specific phrase overheard could be a prearranged signal. She saw the penthouse not just as a fortress, but as a living, breathing entity, full of hidden opportunities. The days that followed blurred into an intense, sleepless cycle of collaboration. They spent hours poring over security footage, the sterile blue light of the screens illuminating their faces in the darkened study. Natalie traced escape routes on blueprints, imagining Valentina's small steps. Marco watched her, seeing the fierce intelligence, the quiet determination etched on her features. He saw her point out a blind spot in a corridor, an oversight his trained men had missed. He saw her suggest a simple yet brilliant way to hide a panic button inside Valentina's favorite stuffed animal. Their hands brushed often as they leaned over the screens, pointing, discussing. The air between them hummed, not just with the tension of the threat, but with an undeniable growing current of shared purpose, a deepening unspoken connection. The intellectual challenge, the raw urgency of protecting Valentina, forged a bond stronger than any romantic declaration. Marco found himself watching her, not with suspicion, but with a profound, almost aching sense of admiration. She wasn't just a caregiver. She was a strategist, a fearless protector, a woman who commanded respect through sheer force of will and a brilliant mind. He saw beyond her status, beyond her past, to the core of who she was, a woman of unwavering integrity, fierce loyalty, and surprising resilience. And Natalie, as she watched him, meticulously plan, his gaze always returning to Valentina's name on the map, saw beyond the formidable boss, beyond the cold facade of the Mafia heir. She saw a father, desperate and vulnerable, willing to shed his pride, to trust a complete outsider, all for the sake of his child. They were two unlikely allies, bound by a shared crisis, seeing each other, truly seeing each other, for the very first time. The sterile hum of the penthouse's myriad security systems felt like a mocking whisper. Marco's tech team, a phalanx of intense, sharp-eyed men, had systematically torn through every known device, every camera, every listening post in the vast apartment. They'd found nothing, not a single bug, not a compromised network. They reported their findings to Marco in clipped, frustrated tones, their faces grim. Natalie watched from the periphery, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. How could they find nothing when the enemy kept proving they knew everything? The rival's latest message, a cryptic email sent directly to Marco's personal, supposedly uncompromised account, detailed Valentina's exact breakfast order from that morning. It was a chilling, undeniable proof that the leak was still active, still invisible. Frustration mounted, a palpable tension in the air. Marco paced, his jaw tight, his eyes like storm clouds. His most trusted men, usually so efficient, looked lost. Natalie's gaze drifted to the nursery, to the quiet hum she knew emanated from the baby. Monitor perched innocently on the shelf. It was a simple device meant for comfort, for peace of mind. But something about it, something about that night, had always felt off. She hesitated, her pulse quickening. Who was she? A maid, to question Marco's highly trained tech experts. Yet her intuition screamed it had already led her to Elena. She took a deep breath, pushing past the doubt. "Mr. Valentini," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence, startling everyone. All eyes turned to her. Marco stopped his pacing, his intense gaze settling on her, an unreadable mix of exhaustion and expectation. "I know your team has checked everything," she continued, choosing her words carefully. "But what about the baby monitor?" A few of the tech guys exchanged disbelieving glances. A baby monitor? A child's toy? Marco's brow furrowed. "The monitor is a simple audio feed, Natalie. We've scanned it. It's secure." His tone was dismissive, almost patronizing, but Natalie saw the flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a memory perhaps of that night. He remembered the lullaby. He remembered how it had changed everything. "I know it seems insignificant," Natalie pressed, stepping forward, her conviction growing. "But I remember that night when Valentina was inconsolable, and I sang to her." She swallowed, recalling the raw emotion of that moment. "The lullaby. It's unique. My mother's song. It calmed her instantly, but after I finished, the monitor, it felt dead, silent. Like it wasn't picking up the ambient sounds anymore, even though it should have been. It was too quiet." She remembered the sudden, eerie stillness that had fallen over the room, an unnatural calm after the song, as if the device itself had gone dormant, then reactivated. It was a feeling, a subtle shift in the air, that only someone intensely present in that moment, in that intimate space, would notice. Marco's eyes, which had been dismissive, widened almost imperceptibly. He remembered the power of her voice, the profound effect it had on Valentina and on him. He remembered the stillness, yes, the way the world had seemed to hold its breath. He had dismissed it as the magic of the moment, the relief of his daughter's peace. But Natalie's words, her quiet, unwavering certainty, sparked a memory, a suspicion that settled deep in his gut. His tech team dealt with known threats, visible signals. Natalie dealt with human intuition, with the unseen, the felt, and her intuition had been right. Before. He looked at his tech team, then back at Natalie. Her gaze was direct, unwavering, filled with a quiet confidence that demanded to be heard. His instinct, the one that had always served him well in his dangerous world, screamed at him to listen to her. He clenched his jaw, a muscle twitching. "Take it apart," he commanded, his voice sharp, decisive, directed at his lead tech specialist. "Every piece, every circuit, and don't tell me it's just a baby monitor again." The tech chief nodded, a reluctant respect dawning in his eyes as he looked from Marco to Natalie. The simple, innocent device, a symbol of childhood, was about to reveal its dark secret. The lead tech specialist, a man named Davies with perpetually tired eyes, carefully lifted the baby monitor from its shelf. He looked at Natalie, then at Marco, a clear skepticism on his face. He expected a child's toy. Natalie knew better. She watched, her breath held tight in her chest as he began to work, his precise fingers dismantling the casing. The plastic snapped open, revealing the delicate electronics inside. Davies frowned, peering closer, then his eyes widened. "Mr. Valentini," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. There's something here." Natalie leaned forward, her heart pounding. Davies used a tiny tool to pry open a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled among the monitor's standard components, was a minuscule circuit board and a SIM card, smaller than a fingernail. It wasn't part of the original device. It was an add-on, expertly concealed. A cold, sick feeling settled in Natalie's stomach. She had been right. "This is a sophisticated bugging device," Davies explained, his voice grim. "It's designed to piggyback on the existing network, but also to broadcast independently via this SIM, encrypted real-time audio and video feed, and it's been active." Marco's face was a mask of thunderous fury. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. He took the tiny SIM card from Davies, turning it over in his large fingers as if it were a venomous insect. The betrayal was palpable, thick in the air. This wasn't just a breach, it was a deep, personal invasion. The tech team sprang into action, tracing the signal, pulling up data logs. Natalie watched, mesmerized and horrified, as lines of code scrolled across their screens. "It's been active for weeks, Mr. Valentini," another tech confirmed, his voice hushed. "Daily uploads, and here, the first activation. It corresponds exactly with Ms. Ross's first day." A wave of nausea washed over Natalie. Her first day, the test Marco had unknowingly begun. It had been compromised from the very start. Every conversation, every interaction, every soft word she'd spoken to Valentina had been broadcast. She felt violated, exposed. The innocent moments, the tender lullabies, all laid bare for an unknown, sinister audience. Then, a chilling realization hit her. The nanny agency. The owner's too eager smile, her overly specific questions about Natalie's background, her financial situation, the way she'd emphasized Marco's need for discretion almost too much, and the key fob, the small black rectangle she still had, a seemingly innocuous object that now felt heavy with sinister meaning. The pieces clicked into place, a horrifying, undeniable puzzle. The owner, that perfectly coiffed woman, had been the one to plant it. She'd been the conduit, the willing accomplice. Marco stood beside her, his body rigid with suppressed rage. His eyes, usually so guarded, now burned with a terrifying intensity. He wasn't looking at the tech team or at the damning evidence on the screens. He was looking at Natalie, his gaze sweeping over her, as if seeing her anew. The anger wasn't for her. It was for the betrayal, the ruthless violation of his home, his child, her safety. "No harm to children," he muttered, his voice low, guttural, a primal growl. "No coercion, debts paid clean." His own code, the principles he lived by, had been desecrated, twisted into a weapon against him. Someone had abused his trust, used a child as leverage, and dragged an innocent woman into the crossfire. His fury was a cold, dangerous fire, and Natalie felt its heat, knowing that the person responsible would pay a very heavy price. The invisible thread of betrayal had finally been cut, revealing a gaping wound. The tech team's words were a cold, hard slap to Natalie's face. "Confirmed, Mr. Valentini, the nanny agency owner. Elena Vance. She has substantial gambling debts, and we have audio logs." Davies, the lead tech, zoomed in on a waveform on the screen. "Here, a significant audio spike weeks ago, isolated and analyzed. It's a unique vocal frequency, a distinct melody." He looked at Natalie, a strange mix of apology and awe in his tired eyes. "Your lullaby, Ms. Ross. It was broadcast live, every time." Natalie felt a fresh wave of nausea, a burning sense of violation. Her mother's song, her private comfort, sung to a grieving child, had been stolen, exposed, used. It wasn't just a bug, it was an invasion of her soul. The intimate moment with Valentina, the fragile piece she'd brought, had been a performance for unseen, malicious eyes. Eleanor Vance, with her perfectly coiffed hair and empty smile, had sold them out for gambling debts. Natalie's hands clenched, a furious tremor running through her. Marco stood rigid, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. His eyes, usually so calculating, now burned with a terrifying, righteous rage. "Vance will pay," he stated, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Natalie braced herself, expecting the ruthless, brutal justice of his world. She imagined dark alleyways, silent disappearances. "But then," he continued, his gaze sweeping over his men, then settling on her, "but not by my hand, not in my way." His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping. "My code stands. No harm to children, no coercion, debts paid clean. Eleanor Vance betrayed my trust, threatened my daughter, but I will not descend to her level. She will face the law. The authorities will handle her." He met Natalie's stunned gaze, his eyes holding a fierce, unyielding resolve. "Valentina deserves a clean resolution, not more shadows." Natalie felt a profound shift within her. This man, whom she had feared, whom she had seen as a monster of control, was revealing a core of honor, a moral compass that, despite his world, he fiercely protected. It wasn't about power for him now. It was about integrity. She saw him, truly saw him, and a fragile seed of trust took root in her heart. "So, the lullaby," Natalie began, her voice still trembling slightly, but now infused with a new purpose. She looked at Marco, a silent question passing between them. He nodded. "It can be our signal." They gathered around the detailed blueprints of the penthouse, the air thick with tension and the unexpected intimacy of their shared purpose. Their plan began to take shape, intricate and dangerous. The lullaby, once a symbol of vulnerability, would now be a weapon. "When the blackout hits," Marco explained, his finger tracing a path on the map from the nursery to a hidden door, "that's your cue. You start the lullaby. It's unique enough, distinctive. It will trigger the smart lights in the nursery, disorienting anyone inside. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. And it's my signal to hold my men back. The police will be moments away. Natalie nodded, her mind racing. And when the lights flicker, that's when I move Valentina. She envisioned every step, every breath. She would wrap Valentina in the red wool blanket, a silent shroud of protection, and guide her to the hidden panic room, a secure sanctuary within the walls. They rehearsed the sequence in hushed whispers, the gravity of their plan pressing down on them. Marco explained the precise timing, the cues, the small, almost imperceptible signals he would give. Later, as Valentina slept soundly in her bed, oblivious to the storm brewing around her, Natalie and Marco walked through the empty nursery, a silent, intense collaboration. He showed her the exact path, the precise angle to take, how to open the panic room door without a sound. Their movements were fluid, practiced, like dancers in a deadly ballet. He reached for her hand, not in romance, but in guidance, positioning her, demonstrating. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she focused, absorbing every detail. The red wool blanket, once a symbol of her confinement, was now a practical tool, a shield. The nanny agency key fob, still clutched in her pocket, was no longer just a relic of betrayal. It was evidence, a piece of the puzzle that would bring Eleanor Vance to justice. They were ready. The lullaby would be heard again, not as a broadcast, but as an echo of defiance and protection. The snow fell thick and silent, a curtain of white against the black canvas of the New York night. Inside the penthouse nursery, the dim glow of the nightlight cast long, dancing shadows, making familiar toys seem like silent sentinels. Natalie sat on the floor beside Valentina's bed, her back pressed against the cool wall, every nerve ending screaming with anticipation. Valentina slept, a small, innocent bundle, her breathing soft and even beneath the plush red wool blanket. Natalie traced the outline of the child's cheek, a fierce, protective love swelling in her chest. This fragile piece, this precious life, was what they were fighting. 4. The air was heavy, charged, like the moments before a storm. She knew Marco and his men were in position, hidden in the shadows of the vast penthouse, waiting. He had explained the strategy: let the rivals' men make their move, draw them in, then spring the trap. Eleanor Vance, the treacherous nanny agency owner, had given them everything. Under pressure, desperate for her payoff, she'd provided the precise timing, the entry points, the security blind spots. Natalie could almost hear the woman's panicked whispers, selling them out for a gambling debt. The thought made a cold anger churn in Natalie's stomach. A faint, almost imperceptible click echoed from the main corridor, a sound that would have gone unnoticed hours ago. But now, in the hyper-tuned silence, it was a gunshot. Natalie's heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. This was it, the moment. She glanced at the baby monitor, now just an empty shell of betrayal, its hidden SIM card removed. A shiver ran down her spine. They were coming. Then, without warning, the world plunged into absolute darkness. The nightlight died. The city lights outside vanished, swallowed by a deliberate, total blackout. Blackness, thick and suffocating, enveloped the nursery. Natalie gasped, a tiny sound lost in the sudden void. But even as fear clawed at her, a strange calm settled. This was Marco's signal. The confrontation had begun. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm, but her resolve, forged in defiance, and love, was pure steel. She would not fail Valentina. The silence that followed was terrifying, broken only by the frantic beat of her own pulse in her ears. She strained to hear, to see, her eyes useless in the absolute dark. A soft creak came from the nursery door, barely audible, then another, closer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. They were inside. Shadowy figures, darker than the darkness itself, began to materialize at the edge of her peripheral vision, moving with a predatory stealth. They expected an easy snatch. They expected a helpless child, a terrified maid. They expected darkness to be their ally. But Natalie had a lullaby. The shadowy figures solidified, hulking shapes against the absolute blackness. They were inside. Natalie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating dark, but her mind was a steel trap. Now, this was it. Clutching Valentina closer, she took a breath, a silent prayer for strength, and began to sing. Her voice, a fragile whisper at first, then gaining power, filled the void. It was her mother's lullaby, the unique, haunting melody, now imbued with a desperate urgency. Lullaby in the dark, code activated. The notes shimmered in the air, a beacon in the terrifying black. She didn't look at the intruders. She looked at Valentina, pressing the child's small head against her shoulder, shielding her, pouring every ounce of her will into the song. Then, just as Marco promised, chaos erupted, the smart lights in the nursery flickered, not a steady illumination, but a blinding strobe-like assault. White light, then black, then white again, jarring and disorienting. The intruders, caught off guard, stumbled. Shouts of confusion, guttural curses tore through the nursery. They were disoriented, their predatory stealth shattered. Natalie kept singing, her voice unwavering amidst the flickering lights and the sudden violent commotion. This was her moment. She pulled the red wool blanket tighter around Valentina, cocooning the child in its soft warmth, a physical shield against the terror. Valentina stirred, a small whimper escaping her lips. But Natalie's song, familiar and comforting even in the chaos, kept her from fully waking. Natalie moved, her movements honed by their quiet rehearsals, swift and silent as a phantom in the strobe-lit room. She didn't run. She glided, keeping low, using the flickering lights to her advantage, a blur of motion in the fractured light. She knew the path. Intimately, left turn, then a small alcove, then the hidden panel disguised as a bookshelf. The intruders were still shouting, bumping into furniture, their eyes struggling to adjust to the blinding flashes. One of them, a bulky silhouette, staggered dangerously close, his hand reaching out blindly. Natalie ducked, pressing herself flat against the wall. Valentina clutched tight. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't stop singing. The melody, a lifeline, a shield. Then the panel. Her fingers, trembling but precise, found the almost invisible seam, pressed the hidden switch. A soft click. The bookshelf swung inward, revealing a dark, cramped space. The panic room. She slipped inside, pulling Valentina with her, the red blanket a vibrant flash in the darkness. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm, but she was in. She reached back, her hand fumbling for the hidden latch, pulling the heavy panel shut with a soft thud. Air rushed out of her lungs. They were safe. She was still, singing, her voice now muffled, a desperate lullaby echoing in the confined space. Outside, the chaos intensified, muffled shouts, the crash of breaking glass, the thud of bodies. Natalie squeezed her eyes shut, pulling Valentina closer, burying her face in the child's soft hair. She heard Marco's voice then, distinct and powerful, even through the thick walls. "Hold! Hold your positions! Police are here!" He was holding his men back. He was honoring his code. He was letting the law handle it. Then the wail, distant at first, then growing louder, piercing the night. Police sirens, a chorus of them converging on the penthouse. The sounds of struggle outside intensified, then abruptly ceased, replaced by the crackle of police radios, the authoritative shouts of officers. Natalie let out a shuddering breath, her body trembling with delayed shock. It was over. The lullaby had worked. The danger was gone. She held Valentina, still humming the melody, tears finally streaming down her face, not of fear, but of profound, overwhelming relief. The muffled sounds of the struggle outside the panic room slowly faded, replaced by the authoritative crackle of police radios and the clipped professional voices of officers. Natalie clutched Valentina, her small body still trembling against her own, and let out a shuddering breath. It was over. The danger was gone. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the panic room walls, but now they felt like a shield, not a prison. Tears, hot and silent, finally streamed down her face, not of fear, but of profound, overwhelming relief. Valentina stirred, whimpering softly, and Natalie gently stroked her hair, humming the last notes of the lullaby. After what felt like an eternity, the latch on the panic room door clicked. Marco's face appeared in the opening, etched with raw relief, his eyes searching, desperate. He saw Natalie, still clutching Valentina, and a wave of emotion washed over his features, stripping away his usual control. He was no longer the formidable boss. He was just a father, terrified and grateful. He reached for Valentina first, scooping her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, a guttural sound of pure, unadulterated relief escaping him. Valentina, still half asleep, nestled into him, her small hand clutching his jacket. Then his gaze, intense and unyielding, found Natalie. It was a look that spoke volumes, gratitude, admiration, a dawning realization of everything she had done. He reached out a hand, pulling her gently from the panic room, bringing her into the aftermath. The penthouse, usually pristine, was a scene of controlled chaos. Uniformed officers moved efficiently, securing the area. Two men, the intruders, lay subdued on the marble floor, hands cuffed behind their backs, and there, by the shattered remains of a vase, stood Eleanor Vance, the nanny agency owner. Her perfectly coiffed hair was disheveled, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes wide with terror as an officer led her away in handcuffs. She looked at Natalie, a flicker of desperate pleading in her eyes, quickly replaced by a defeated slump. Natalie met her gaze. No pity, only a cold, hard understanding of betrayal. The threat was neutralized. The villain caught. Marco still held Valentina, but his eyes never left Natalie. He looked at her, truly saw her, not as a maid, not as an employee, but as an indispensable partner, a force of nature who had saved his daughter. She felt a surge of power, a quiet confidence she hadn't known she possessed. She had proven herself not just to him, but to herself. Her autonomy, her instincts, her courage. They were not weaknesses to be suppressed, but strengths to be wielded. She had fought for Valentina, and in doing so had fought for herself. She took a deep breath, the taste of smoke and adrenaline still on her tongue. Her future, once dictated by debt and desperation, was now hers to claim. She looked at Marco, at the raw emotion. In his eyes, and she knew, she would stay. She would continue to care for Valentina, to be a part of this strange, unconventional family they had become. But it would be on her terms, not as a maid, not as a possession, but as an equal. "Marco," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. He looked at her, waiting, his gaze holding a quiet reverence. "I will stay, for Valentina, and for you, but it won't be as an employee." She saw the surprise flicker in his eyes, quickly replaced by an expectant intensity. "I will be Valentina's caregiver, an integral part of her life and yours, but it will be on a contract I write." She met his gaze, unflinching. "I require clear, defined hours with proper compensation. I require my own space, respected and undisturbed, and my decision-making power regarding Valentina's daily care, her well-being, her activities, that is mine." You will have input, of course, but I am not to be overruled without just cause. I am a partner in this, not a subordinate. No more gilded cages, no more feeling owned. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken challenges and profound implications. Marco stared at her, his dark eyes searching hers, seeing the unshakable resolve, the quiet strength that had faced down armed intruders, and his own formidable will. He saw her integrity, her fierce independence, the very qualities that had saved his daughter. He saw her completely. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his face. "Agreed," he said, his voice a low, firm rumble, not a hint of resistance. "Every word. You are not an employee, Natalie. You are indispensable, a partner, always." He extended a hand, not for a handshake, but an open gesture of acceptance, of respect, of something much deeper. Natalie took it, her fingers brushing his, and a jolt, warm and electric, passed between them. It was a silent promise, a forging of a new path. Her autonomy was affirmed, and in Marco's eyes she saw not just a boss, but a man ready to build a future together. Weeks later, the bitter chill of winter had softened into the tentative promise of spring, and with it, the pervasive tension in the penthouse had finally begun to thaw. The nanny agency, Eleanor Vance's carefully constructed facade, was dismantled, its owner facing the full, unforgiving weight of the law. Justice, clean and cold, had been served, just as Marco had promised. Valentina's world, once fractured and shadowed, was now safer, more stable, filled with the quiet hum of peace. Natalie watched the little girl one afternoon, playing by the vast windows overlooking Central Park. The cracked ballerina music box, once a symbol of broken innocence, now sat gleaming on Valentina's nightstand, its delicate porcelain figure expertly repaired. Natalie had found a small, discreet artisan who understood the sentimental value. She wound the key, and the familiar haunting melody of her mother's lullaby drifted through the room, soft and clear. Valentina looked up, a bright, unburdened smile on her face, and Natalie felt a profound sense of rightness settle in her chest. The song that had been stolen, exposed, and then used as a weapon was now simply a melody of comfort and home. Valentina drifted to sleep that evening, her breathing even and deep. The lullaby Natalie hummed a soft, comforting presence in the quiet nursery. The red wool blanket, once a heavy symbol of Natalie's confinement, now simply lay draped over Valentina, a cozy, familiar warmth. Natalie lingered, watching the peaceful rise and fall of the child's chest, a profound sense of belonging blooming in her heart. Marco joined her, silent as always, leaning against the doorframe. His gaze, no longer guarded, held a quiet warmth, a tenderness that sent a shiver down Natalie's spine. Their romance had begun to bloom, careful and mutual, like a delicate spring flower. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures, just quiet. Moments, shared glances, the comfortable brush of hands as they tended to Valentina. It was a love built on the foundation of shared trauma, on the deep respect they had forged in the crucible of danger, and on the unshakable trust that had grown between them. He saw her, truly saw her, not just for her strength, but for her quiet compassion, her unwavering integrity. And she, in turn, saw past the formidable aura of the Mafia boss to the grieving father, the man of unwavering code who had chosen honor over vengeance. One evening, Marco led her to his study. The room, once a place of intimidating power, now felt different, infused with a new purpose. He showed her a series of documents. "I've established a foundation," he explained, his voice low, a quiet pride in his tone. for single mothers struggling with medical debts, and for children's charities. He looked at her, his eyes holding a vulnerability she was only just beginning to understand. Your plight, Natalie, opened my eyes. My code demands clean debts, but also a clean conscience. This is a way to leverage what I have for good. It was an act of redemption, a quiet testament to the man she was falling in love with, the man who was using his power to heal, not to harm. Natalie felt a lump form in her throat. Her own past, her own struggles, had become a catalyst for something profound. She looked at the documents, then back at Marco, a soft, genuine smile gracing her lips. "It's beautiful, Marco," she whispered. He smiled, a rare, breathtaking curve of his lips that softened the hard lines of his face. "I want you to oversee it, with me." He wasn't asking for her help. He was offering her a partnership, a true equality. Natalie, no longer just a caregiver, but an equal partner in their unconventional found family, felt her heart swell. This was her purpose, her voice, her autonomy, affirmed in the most profound way. Later, as the city lights twinkled outside, a silent promise of a new day. Natalie and Marco stood by Valentina's bedside, looking down at the sleeping child. The lullaby, softly playing from the repaired music box, filled the room. Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining, a silent promise exchanged between them. It was a future woven in music and trust, built on love, consent, and a mutual respect that had blossomed from the ashes of fear. Natalie leaned her head against Marco's shoulder, a quiet contentment settling over her. Her gilded cage had become a home, and she, the singer with no stage, had finally found her voice and her family. If you enjoyed the video, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel to keep up with our content.